The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jotham Busfield. I'm here with my co-host John Cuna. Today we'll be discussing Serena Williams and anger. So most of our episodes will have this format where we discuss one athlete and one issue, sometimes a mental health issue. In this case, it's an emotion. Quick bio on Serena Williams. She's an American professional tennis player and former world number one in women's single tennis. The Women's Tennis Association ranked her number one in singles on 8 separate occasions between 2002 and 2017. And on her 6th occasion, she held the ranking for 186 consecutive weeks, tying the record set by Steffi Graf. She holds 23 singles Grand Slam titles, 14 more in doubles, which is the most in the Open era. Steffi Graf had 22, so she beat that record. She's now 39 years old and continues to play and has expressed a desire to break the all-era record of 24 singles Grand Slam titles held by Margaret Court. A few random facts about Serena Williams that we found interesting. Her dad, Richard, decided to teach her and her sister, Venus, to play tennis after seeing a guy win $40,000 for a tournament. Taught himself how to play tennis watching instructional videos so that he could teach them how to play. He made them learn Spanish and French, and also brought other kids to boo during practice to condition them to adapt. He was very well known in Compton. I think everyone, I think they called him King Richard. He was very well known. She's the youngest of 5 sisters. She even signed herself up for a tournament at age 9 without her parents knowing, and the parents found out because the tournament told them they had to pay up. And she ended up playing and made it to the finals, lost to her sister Venus in the final. She grew up in Compton, California, and moved to Florida at age 9 to train for tennis. She won the 2017 Australian Open while pregnant. If that's not Grim Drive, I don't know what is. Studied fashion at the Art Institute of Fort Lauderdale from 2003 to 2005, while she was winning tournaments at the same time. Studied kinesiology and took pre-med classes at UMass Amherst in 2011. She's a vocal advocate for pay equity for female tennis players. In 2017, she also became the ambassador for the Purple Purse Project, which is the Allstate Foundation's initiative to provide support to domestic violence survivors. She also supports a lot of other charitable organizations, including the Elton John's AIDS Foundation and numerous others, which we put links to in the show notes. She also created Serena Ventures in 2014, which is where she takes her money and invests in companies primarily founded by women and people of color. So for the player spotlight on Serena Williams today, there are numerous articles that have been written about her in terms of her career as a tennis player, her thoughts on her own mental health experience, being a mother, and being an entrepreneur. So we went into a lot of that kind of stuff. I'm going to start by, before kicking it to you, John, I'm going to start with just, why we made this episode about the emotion of anger. And it's kind of interesting why we did it, because, and we'll get to that, but I'm just going to describe the event that took place that kind of aligned, anger with Serena Williams unfairly, which we're going to get into. But the event was the 2018 U.S. Open final where she faced Naomi Osaka. Her coach, Serena Williams' coach, Patrick Mouratoglou, was accused of giving coaching to her during the match, and she was accused of receiving coaching by umpire Carlos Ramos. She denied it to the umpire, then called him a liar and a thief, demanding an apology. I actually thought she handled it pretty well. She wasn't swearing. She was, pretty composed, really. And so she demanded an apology. She ended up getting a code violation and lost a point for the coaching piece. She lost another point for smashing her racket, which anyone who's played tennis has probably done. And no, I have. Penalized a full game for verbal abuse, which is quite kind of unbelievable that you can even use that term to describe what she was doing, and then fined $17,000 after the fact for everything. One thing that stood out to me is that the crowd, how loud the crowd was booing afterwards during the ceremony where they were giving the trophy to Naomi Osaka and Serena Williams was standing next to her. They were very loudly booing at Serena. putting kind of a dark cloud over the whole experience for everybody. So I'll kick it to you, John. What were your main takeaways from diving deep into Serena Williams' experience and how anger has sort of been aligned with her?
Sure. I think it's definitely been a fuel for her. And, I definitely want to acknowledge the fact, I think that the pairing of anger with Serena, I think one thing that we want to really acknowledge is sort of the stereotype of like the angry black female.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's been something she's had to battle against, racism and sexism, both in her sport, but just in her professional life. And so I wanted to really acknowledge that. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that throughout the episode, but that was really the first thing that stood out to me. And I think there's one image in particular where Carlos, the ref, is sitting up high, pointing down at Serena Williams and accusing her of cheating. I think that really struck a chord for a lot of people who are pretty frustrated by that. We're going to dive into the disparities in anger with both man and female, but we want to acknowledge that race definitely played a factor for her, both in 2018, but also just in general throughout her entire career. I think that anger's been something that's, we're going to talk a little bit more about how it can be used, but I think it's for her, one of the things that stood out was, she seems to have a very good control of it. When you see her on the court, she demands the attention in the space. I think she uses it as,
kind of harnesses it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times people talk about anger, and we'll dive more into it, but it really can be used as a pretty effective tool. I like to think of it kind of as like jet fuel or caffeine, that it's, it can really help to jumpstart the system, but if it's the only tool you're using and overuse of it, it can really lead to some stuff that doesn't work very well. And so I think there is a balance of it. And, for the purposes of today, we're going to really be focusing on anger as the emotion and how it can dictate sort of play, but how it can also be a really big interference. And, with working with, not just athletes, but people in general, anger is definitely one of the ones that comes up a lot, and find myself spending a lot of time giving people, help in how to address those things. So that was definitely one of the biggest takeaways that I took from her. Her childhood was definitely something that also stood out to me. There was a lot of exposure to gang violence, a lot of grief, and I think that definitely contributes to some of those things that are going on. Again, I don't want to necessarily speculate, but based on some of her past history, I think that was something that really stood out. She had a pretty committed family to her goals. You mentioned it in the beginning, but her signing herself up for a tournament at 9 and her parents getting sent a bill afterwards was we talk about Grim Drive, but that certainly is a shining moment, an example of it, of someone who's just dedicated to something that brings her so much passion, and to not let anything stand in the way. So those are some of the biggest takeaways that I got from that.
Yeah, I definitely want to touch on all those. I'll start with the anger piece that you kind of started off with, which is there's two layers to this. There's the male-female anger piece, and then there's also the race layer, which is an added layer.
Yeah.
And so for Serena, she's someone who is a black female, so she's in those two categories that are going to make her unfairly treated with comparison to her peers. The male-female piece, it's like guys are considered, if they're angry, especially in sports, but in general, they're considered kind of a fiery competitor. Maybe it's situational, it's justified. That's how their anger is viewed. Whereas women, it's viewed as a personal flaw. It's viewed as crazy. It's viewed as they're over emotional loose cannon, right? That there's something kind of wrong with them, and that relationship between those two views is really where this kind of comes into play. And she even speaks out on this. And what's interesting is about this piece is that she acknowledges that for her, after this kind of incident, she was going through a lot. Really, I think that didn't quite directly relate to the anger, maybe a little bit, but just decided she wanted to take a step back and kind of focus on getting help for other reasons. And at the same time, she also came out and said, "Look, I was sticking up for myself.
Yeah,
I handled it respectfully. It didn't swear." I think there was another incident she went through when she was much younger, around 2009. That she apologized for afterwards, where she was a little bit more vocal. But even that, when you're swearing, I mean, how many times do we see male tennis players just absolutely flipping out?
Well, you look at McEnroe as a perfect example, right?
Yes,
smashing rackets, yelling at refs, and people almost, like the reaction is, people always like, oh, McEnroe, they play it off, say it's intense, or he's passionate.
He cares more than anybody.
He cares, right? Or you laugh it off and you don't treat it like it's the same thing.
Absolutely. And with a woman doing it, especially a black woman, they're unhinged. They're unhinged. There's something to be afraid of. It's ridiculous, the relationship between those two things. I found one of the articles written about Serena actually had a link So as the Inc. article had a link to a couple different studies that were done in 2015, research studies where both men and women viewed anger from women as less persuasive than anger from men, and it was like a 32% swing. It was pretty significant. And as part of that, also men and women, reported that they would work for an aggressive CEO if male, but not female. So this is something that definitely is kind of pervasive in our society. And I think it's hard to know what the answer is, and this is one thing that I was kind of juggling with is the answer for guys to be held more accountable, or is the answer for women to be given more leeway to do the same thing that guys are already allowed to do? I almost think the answer is kind of in the middle, regardless of gender, and that the solution is not for females to be less angry, but it's to raise awareness about the bias, right? Education, awareness about the bias is the only way that we're going to get to a point where people are treated equally, right? Equal treatment, equal application of rules, laws, expectations is I think what we're going for.
Right.
And one example that this is from a totally different situation, but I believe this came from like a Malcolm Gladwell podcast. It was something where they covered this example of inherent bias, and it was in the court, in the district courts, I think, where they took a look at the data with regard to judges, and I don't know if you've seen this one, where judges, how they sentence people before they eat lunch versus after they eat lunch is drastic. But before they eat lunch, way heavier hand. Maybe a little bit hangry.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe we can get into that type of anger today.
Yeah.
After they eat lunch, way more lenient, right? So is the answer to have them be less or more lenient before lunch, or have a heavier hand after lunch? No, the answer is to let them know about this bias, educate them, and that's what they did. The court system put them through a inherent bias training, let them know about these things that they weren't even aware about, whether it comes to race, whether it comes to their own emotions and being hungry before they have sentencing, that kind of thing, and it did level off.
Yeah.
So the after they got educated about this stuff, their sentencing was more even, regardless of before or after lunch when they were handing down these things. So
Right.
I think so. The male-female anger piece is definitely one where if you're a male, you're allowed to be angry, and it's it makes you a competitor. If you're female, you're not allowed to. Then you, like you said, John, you added in that layer of race where black women and this kind of like angry, over emotional trope, they're just not treated equally in this department as well as many other departments. I mean, you could look at the Serena Williams and the cat suit incident where she's wearing a compression suit during a match because I think she had given birth fairly recently and had blood clots, which we're going to get into.
Yeah.
Almost died. So she's wearing a compression suit, which helps with your health. And the tennis world, which takes all these stereotypes to the nth degree, made her change it, right? So that's one. There was also an incident with her opponent in the U.S. Open match in 2018 that we're talking about, Naomi Osaka. There was a bikini controversy with her where she's ridiculed on social media for wearing a bikini. Whereas if a guy is out there with his shirt off, I'm sure it would just be he's in shape and nothing said, nothing bad certainly. So I made a note of this because the whole women piece is one, but the Black American piece comes in here too, because they are actually one of the least likely groups to seek mental health assistance. They're much more reliant on church and faith, which is a good thing. That second piece. And then Black Americans are more likely to have undiagnosed mental health challenges that impair functioning everyday life. Research has actually tied a prolonged exposure to chronic stress that accompanies racism to higher rates of infant and maternal mortality rates, which that relates to her because that's what she went through. I mean, she almost died when she was giving birth. And we talk a lot about this, but mental health issues are often have hereditary links. I think people don't always understand this, that alcoholism, anxiety, depression, these things continue through family lineages. So the people that sit here and say, slavery ended how many years ago, get over it, they don't, you have to sit back and recognize how that gets passed down, just the chronic stress from generation to generation, how that gets passed down. And that doesn't even cover the fact that slavery doesn't exist anymore, but racism very much does.
Right.
We know that, just by what's been going on in popular culture in the last year, especially. There's a lot of examples of that. So it's just to say that mental health issues are not always just about your life. They're also about your family's life and your family's, generations before you, things like that. So
yeah, I'd encourage you, anyone listening. David Robinson does a TED talk basically on how racism is physically harming people of color and disproportionately getting access to mental health. Like you said, they're less likely to seek it, but also less likely to get good care. And then just so it's taxing physically and killing people of color quicker because of this issue.
Which David Robinson was that?
It was on TED Talk. I can't remember the name. I'll put the link in the show notes for people.
Okay, nice. So let's see. So that is something where, I think we covered the male female anger piece. We covered the how Serena is also a black woman and she has to deal with that. I think for guys listening in particular, if you disagree with the things that we just talked about, then you're clearly living in denial, and I think there's a lot of that going on these days. And I think I would encourage any guy out there listening to this who's kind of like rolling his eyes and thinking that we're over exaggerating this stuff, just to take a look at why you have to refuse to acknowledge these realities. What fear or discomfort does it cause you?
Right.
Because if you are secure, confident, comfortable, there'd be no reason to not acknowledge the realities of what we're discussing. Yep. No reason.
No, I'd encourage anyone that has any disagreement, if they wanted to call us up, we'd be happy to have a conversation and start that going.
Absolutely. So we got to that takeaway. I mean, one other one I had was that anger is kind of an underlying emotion, right? Anger is caused by underlying emotions that are not anger. So usually I like to refer to anger as a secondary emotion, right? Whereas there's usually a primary emotion driving it, whether that's fear, shame, sadness, things like that. Grief, absolutely, trauma, things like that. So, for me, anger is rarely, what you see on the surface is rarely what's actually going on underneath. And I think a lot of times anger management is kind of confused with solving in the moment problems. I think it has nothing to do with that. I think it's usually too late, right? You're kind of in fight or flight mode.
You've missed your chance.
Absolutely. So anger, when I talk about anger and underlying emotions, anger at times, but not always, taps into underlying mental health issues. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Again, she came out and said that the anger was indicative of a problem for her. So she admitted that she wanted to use that as a moment to grow and change. She was quoted as saying, "I couldn't find peace. I was searching for answers." So she wanted to get help, but she still should have been given leeway to advocate for herself, which I think is a big piece.
Right.
So another takeaway from me is that she gave birth to her daughter in August or September of 2017. And then this incident that we're talking about took place about a year later in 2018. So, she refers to some factors here, which I would imagine led to her wanting to get help. Again, I don't think it actually showed up in this incident because she handled it really well.
Yeah. She was justified.
Absolutely. But she was talking about how at that time she was, stressed out, anxious about being a parent. Major complications during childbirth led to having a C-section. Post-pregnancy, she had blood clots in her lungs and her abdomen. And she knew something was wrong and advocated for herself with doctors. And I think this is really important to bring up because, to me, she talked about how she didn't understand why she was vilified for how she handled the tennis match incident, because she said, I was just sticking up for myself.
Right.
I think women need to know that they can do that, right? They have to be given the room to do that, especially because of how it played out in her medical situation, right? There's a lot of inherent racial bias in the medical world. There's a lot of bias against women in the medical world too. If you're someone who just gave pregnancy or just gave birth to a daughter, right, and you're recovering and something's wrong, a lot of doctors will say they know better than you, right? And if you don't speak up, if you don't advocate for yourself, you don't know. I mean, she could have died, right, if she didn't do that. So I think the same sort of confidence and her backing herself that it took to speak up in a tennis match, it took to speak up post giving birth, which saved her life.
Right. I think that's part of the design, right, of like her speaking up and then falling into that stereotype of the angry black woman, so then you can dismiss it and not actually listen to what her grievances are. I think that's just part of that design, and it stinks because for people who are watching that piece, they see all this unfold, and then they're sort of like, well, then what if Serena Williams can't even stand up for herself and advocate for herself? What's the point? How am I to be able to do that? So her coming out and speaking about that directly, I think, is does an enormous amount of work for that issue.
Yeah, and she even says, if I might be vilified for it, but at least maybe the next woman, next girl will be able to not have that happen.
Right.
Which is pretty cool because she's willing to, take that hit because she knows that it's necessary to make the progress that she's looking to make.
Because she's a strong, powerful woman who can.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So A couple other takeaways. She said in one article that don't be afraid of the word no, which I thought was awesome but what she's basically saying is you cannot be, afraid of fear or rejection. You can't be driven by those things that fear. And that brings up an important point for me that I think we work on with clients, which is this concept of like a control fallacy, where I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with who they'll take the result that they control, which is worse than the slightly or majorly better result that they can't control, right? And that need for control really pulls the wool over people's eyes, right? So I'll give you an example. We work with a lot of young guys. How many guys have you worked with who will do a project or a paper and then not turn it in? They'll intentionally not turn it in because they feel in control of that zero. They'll take the zero because they chose to not turn it in over turning it in and risking getting a 60 or a 70, or they probably get better than that usually. That's the irony of it. But they will take that outcome that they control, which is way worse than the outcome that's better that they can't control because of how horrible it feels to be out of control. Right?
Yep.
And I think that relates to what she's saying, where you can't be afraid of failure or rejection because the only way something good's going to happen is if you put yourself out there. Not putting yourself out there is a guarantee of bad things happening because nothing will happen. She also mentioned, I don't know if you saw this, but she self-diagnosed herself as having OCD, which I don't know. A lot of people, OCD tends to be kind of a term that's thrown out there a lot of times just because you like order when it isn't really OCD. So I don't know if she actually has OCD, but she did say that she does and that it helps her, which is, if that's true, she does have it and it helps her. It's sometimes kind of cool when people can manage their OCD enough because it does help if you can keep it in check. It helps you stay organized, helps you have order to your life.
Yep.
She is someone who clearly has an insane amount of order to her life because that's one thing that I took away, and she's kind of my Grim Drive example for today. Usually we look outside the athlete that we're talking about. Yeah. You can't, because the amount of stuff she does, being a mother, still winning. She just won another Grand Slam, I think, earlier in 2020. So she's winning tournaments. She's a mother. She's an entrepreneur. The amount of stuff she does on a day-to-day basis is absolutely nuts to me. I got anxious just reading it, to be honest with you. And
all the accolades is like, oh boy.
Oh my goodness, it's unbelievable. So the fact that she's able to stay that ordered and level-headed, and it sounds like she's always on time, always a little bit early or right on time, which is just incredible. She uses a lot of tech apps too. I know she's I think she's married to, was it the Reddit founder?
Yeah.
Co-founder? Yeah.
Yep.
So she mentioned how she has access to latest tech information, which is a nice little thing to have in your pocket as well. So any other takeaways for you, John?
No, it's funny that you brought up the Grim Drive too, because that was going to be something I was going to talk about a little bit later too. But she sort of is like the epitome, like gold standard of like when we talk about Grim Drive, it's her. She embodies all of that. Of her day to day, how much she has to grind in and out, and wants to do it. It's pretty impressive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll get into the mental health spotlight. We're going to talk about anger today, and again, we're talking about this because for her, it's the emotion that led to her coming into the area of talking about her mental health. So we both want to get into it for that reason, while also acknowledging that, ironically, we kind of don't view her handling of that situation as actually an example of uncontrolled, unchecked anger. I mean, it was really the opposite of that.
Right.
So big caveat here, right? We're talking about anger, but it's kind of funny because it's not really a great example of anger, because all she did was really slam a racket. Where if you're a competitive athlete, you're going to do that stuff from time to time in the moment.
Yep.
So in terms of our takeaways, regarding anger, some data on anger, what to do about it, how to solve it if you're someone struggling with anger issues. There's not a ton. It's kind of hard to find data on anger because it's a very subjective kind of thing. My main takeaway was that people seem to be getting more and more angry, overall, right? So we can talk about why that is. Anger can also lead to a lot of physical and mental health issues. So mental health issues can drive it, but also anger can drive worsening health. And then we're living in a time that functions as sort of I saw one term somewhere where it called it like an anger incubator, which I think is kind of right? Because the human brain is already slanted towards negativity three times stronger than positivity. When you factor in media, social media, and that kind of thing, I'm sure that's even much worse, right?
Yep.
So we're in this like kind of incubator where anger is just kind of allowed to grow and fester. So that's kind of, so we didn't have any like actual data points other than it just seems like it's getting worse overall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just from experience of like who's walking through the door and who I'm working with, it's been certainly a spike.
For sure. And we know anger is something that, again, it's driven by, it's a secondary emotion in my experience, not always, but most of the time, secondary emotion driven by other primary emotions. And so I think it tends to be driven by a combination of one or more primary emotions first: sadness, shame, fear, anxiety, things like that. And then also it's cumulative, right? And so the answer, understanding anger, is also, there's an answer built into that, because if you understand that it's cumulative, you know that you have to intervene early. We talk a lot about reactive versus proactive strategies for different mental health issues. There's nowhere where that's more relevant than this, because there really is no reaction option to anger. There's not. I mean, because you're in fight or flight mode. All you can do is hope that it ends quick, without you doing something really stupid that you can't take back.
Yep.
So when it comes to anger, I think you have to understand that it's cumulative and it builds, and you have to have a release valve somewhere earlier on to let some of that build out a little bit before it spills over. So think of, like, I don't know what analogy you use with clients. I tend to use like a water bottle spilling over, or a container getting too full and kind of exploding.
Yep.
That if you're not emptying that water bottle here and there through different healthy coping strategies, or intervening earlier to understand the anger, it's going to explode, or it's going to spill over.
Yeah, the example I usually use is like a shaken, like 2-liter Coke can, right?
Yep.
Like if you shake it once, the cap's not going to explode, but if you continuously shake it and don't like slowly release that pressure valve, eventually it's going to blow. And anger works very, very similar to that. Emotions in general, but anger especially.
Absolutely. So again, before we get in, we're going to get into what to do about it, right? If you're someone dealing with anger, this is especially relevant for guys, right? So we're going to talk about that. But we always like to give a disclaimer on sort of mental health tips, right? A lot of tools and strategies with mental health are easy to understand and hard to execute. Easy to understand, hard to execute, right? We can sit here and talk all day about what to do, and they might sound like easy things, but go ahead and try them, because they're not easy, right? So sometimes the situation, or the solution is, it's easy to wrap your head around, but it's not so easy to actually put into practice day to day. We always like to preface that. We also like to have a disclaimer about trying to connect with a mental health professional. If you're someone dealing with anger or other mental health issues, getting help is always part of the process, in our opinion. So, John, I wanted to ask you, because when it comes to anger, I think we almost have to view it as like sports anger versus real life anger. I think they're kind of two different areas. In sports, a little anger can help focus, right? A lot can sabotage. I think it's a very fine line, slippery slope to rely on anger in sports, and possibly a sign that self-worth and outcomes are overlapping a little bit when you're using anger too much in sports. I wanted to ask you, what's an alternative? You do a lot of work with athletes. Do you encourage them to use anger to the right amount, right? Because that can be a fuel. Or do you look to say, well, maybe we should get away from using anger as fuel? And if you do, like, what are some other things that you go to?
So I definitely try to gauge sort of independently based off of who I'm working with. I think a lot of athletes sometimes come in and to a certain extent, you alluded to this before, but especially in male sports, anger is not only encouraged but coached.
Yep.
So I think it's sort of like this ingrained lesson that male athletes especially learn going through their development. And it's so, I think for some athletes it can work as sort of like that spark to get themselves in the zone. But if it's the sole thing that they use to carry themselves through, it's incredibly draining. It uses too much energy. Your focus goes down, all of those different pieces. So I try to gauge and use it more as like a starter. But really the biggest, most important thing that I always do with all of my clients is to make sure that they actually have control of it. So whether they choose to use it or not is, in my opinion, slightly irrelevant, much more around, are you in control? Like if so for hockey, lacrosse, or whatever, when you hit the ice or you hit the field, are you angry? Why are you angry? And is it actually doing what you think it's doing? Because I think a lot of times, like I said, athletes get coached to be angry and to be tough and to be fearless, right? All these different words that they get thrown at them. And so then when they go out to the field, if you get checked off the puck, are you then only now focused on getting back at that person, or are you able to refocus and engage in the game and let that incident go, right? That's kind of the balance of where anger can be helpful. And can be a deterrent. Like if you're focused on just hitting somebody back, you've completely lost focus of the ultimate goal, which is to provide and win for the team. So, I think it's case by case. I definitely find myself more often steering away from it and coming more to a sense of sort of like neutrality or sort of equilibrium and sort of leveled off. I definitely find myself coming more to that because you're much more in control of that moment to moment rather than anger is an extremely powerful emotion, and like I said, if it's used appropriately, it can be like jet fuel, like it can get you into orbit, but then it's not going to help you get back down. And so being neutral is you are in complete control of the different outcomes that are happening during the game, and you're able to stay more present. And what we know now from research and from just look around at the professional athletes working with people who are doing this, but mindfulness in athletics is huge, and present moment focus is where a lot of the attention is right now, and anger really doesn't help put you in that place for extended periods of time. So I try to gauge. I definitely lean more towards coming back at this more of like neutrality. Trevor Moawad, who's one of the guys he worked with, Cam Newton and Russell Wilson and a lot of those guys, he talks a lot about like neutrality. And I think that that's definitely something that I try to pull from as well. And to your point, that I think that anger is often a secondary emotion. It's in my experience, it's usually sadness. That's one of the primary that goes on. And so if they're using anger, but it's really sadness that they're using in those moments, then games can get really, really disrupted. And so I think a firm understanding of like, is it anger? Are you just using it as fuel? Do you have control of it? And if so, then we can talk about using it. But if not, then it's not an effective tool to use.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned some great things because you touched on mindfulness, and I would imagine, and you can tell me, I would imagine mindfulness is really important because it would allow you to, obviously it's about staying in the moment, and I think that will allow you to stay in the present moment as an athlete, which is going to prevent your focus or the mindset you're in from bleeding into your personal life, because I think that's what happens when you talk about getting into situations where an athlete is vulnerable to going after someone, right, to almost like get revenge.
Yep.
That to me is a clear-cut sign that it has now bled into your personal life, right? Whether that's family life or it's overlapping with your real life in some kind of way. Individual issues you're going through, family life, stuff like that. That emotion has now bled into the situation as an athlete, and it's going to hijack you, and it is not going to allow you to reach your goal. So that's, I think, where mindfulness would be so important, because it's going to keep you in that role of an athlete, right? To really maximize what you're attempting to do, what your goal and focus should be, instead of all these other things coming through from real life. And I think, to me, that touches on a bigger point that I didn't see mentioned in our research with Serena, but I did see a lot in our research for the next episode on Michael Phelps. When it comes to Olympic athletes, we heard I've read a lot of Olympic athletes kind of talking about, and even Kevin Love from our first episode talking about how they have a lot of access to sports psychologists, but they don't have anyone that's really talking to them about their personal life, about what's really going on. And I think that I know you do a lot of work with that. My focus with athletes I've worked with in the past has always been a lot more about where is your personal life, blending up against or coming up against your life as an athlete, and where are they mixing? Because where they mix is usually a recipe for disaster. At worst, it's going to lead to an absolute meltdown or something catastrophic happening on the field. At best, it's going to distract you, and you're not going to be at the top of your game. So that's something where I feel like we've seen a lot of athletes kind of complain a little bit about, hey, it's good that I'm getting mindset stuff, but I need someone who has a background in understanding how to tap into the things that's going on in the other areas of my life. And I know you do a lot of work with that. You brought up Trevor Moawad and neutrality, and I don't know what that is. So what is neutrality?
So it's basically the concept of not allowing minute to minute or game to game or moment to moment sort of raise you either above or below. So like not being overly excited, because even sort of an overexcitement can lead to distortions in perception and can cause you to sort of be not present in the moment, or the real lows or things like that can also sort of hinder your ability to think presently. And his big thing is just, well, if we can just maintain neutrality, which I think is a sort of synonymous for mindfulness or present moment focus, or in the flow, or whatever you want to call it. It goes by many names, but the real concept, and if you watch Russell Wilson play, he does look pretty stoic on the field, and I think that that's part of the training that he's done with Trevor Moawad, who's been sort of about that idea of, rather than going super, super high and getting possibly distracted, or irrational, or vice versa, going real low and getting sunk down and depressed and maybe losing faith or whatever it happens to be, rather than just let's just stay present in the neutral and execute the way you need to. And so he spends a lot of time talking about that. He wrote a book, It Takes What It Takes, and he talks a lot about that.
Okay, nice. We'll put a link to that,
Yep.
to those things in the show notes as well. So, one point on anger I want to get into is that it really is much more of a male issue, which is ironic because as this episode is titled, right, it's women get so much more flack for it when they're angry.
Yeah.
It's viewed as some unacceptable thing. And in reality, it's way much more of a male issue. I'm not sure if that's in part because of testosterone. I mean, I think it's a couple things. I think testosterone has a role in it. I think the biggest thing is just modeled and accepted behavior and not knowing how to actually tap into their own emotions and understand their own emotions, right? Women are way better at that.
Yeah.
They totally understand, not totally, but like way, they understand how to manage their emotions way more effectively than guys do. And so, so that's part of it, right? Is that guys are definitely not on average as good at understanding and managing their own emotions. And they're often taught, right? This is where the modeled or accepted behavior comes into play. They're often taught growing up from their family, especially their fathers, and society, that anger and silence are really the only options you got, right? You either stay shut or you flip out. I mean, those are your only choices, because you can't cry and you can't express yourself. That's not going to happen.
Nope.
I mean, this comes into play with the playbook, right? The men's playbook that Kevin Love referred to in our first episode. Where you just gotta suck it up, right? Suck it up. Don't complain about it. Don't cry. Don't talk about it. Don't even express any emotions. You just gotta roll with it and be stoic, or get mad, right, and flip out and that kind of thing. So that's really all there. Most guys are taught that those are your only two options, and there's nothing much in between, and that's a huge issue because we've talked about how anger is cumulative, right? So if you're being taught that your only options are silence and anger, and we know anger is cumulative, if you're silent, it's just going to keep building and building and building and building, which leaves you more vulnerable for those flip outs. And I think the main thing I see that drives anger the most for guys, we talked about how anger is a secondary emotion. So what is the primary emotion underneath that's really driving it? It's almost always shame. Almost always shame, right? So I would encourage any guy out there to really look at and really take a step back and figure out what is actually driving my anger here, right? Am I just flipping out for no reason in the moment and it's a one-off? Probably not. Usually it's because there's a lot of other steps that are going on behind the scenes or underneath the surface, where you've been dealing with things for a long time and have not been able to address it or understand it appropriately. It's almost always shame. So we talk about what is shame. Well, there's a good relationship between shame and guilt. Guilt is, and Brene Brown, we talked about in one of our episodes, but she's someone that goes into shame a lot. Guilt is something where you feel bad about what you did. Shame is something where you feel bad about yourself as a person, as a whole, right? And that is very corrosive. It's probably one of the most toxic emotions a person can experience, because it completely just brings you down. So in order to reduce anger, you have to address the shame or the sadness or whatever that primary emotion is. That involves introspection and a lot of personal work. That is not going to happen on a day.
No.
You have to talk to multiple people. You probably have to talk to a trained professional. You definitely have to talk to a family member or a friend you trust, maybe multiple. You got to understand and get a feel for the path that led to this shame building, which is that's the fuel. That's driving your anger, right? Anger is the product, right? The byproduct is the release. But shame is the fuel that's driving it, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of how to deal with anger, again, we like to get into proactive versus reactive strategies. I think anger management is often thought of in the moment, which is too late and not effective. At that point, you're in fight or flight mode, in this case, fight mode.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to remember what to do in the moment for any strategy, because it's too late. At that point, the amygdala, right, the emotional center of your brain, has really taken over, and that's going to be in the driver's seat until it just voluntarily kind of switches off, which can take a few seconds, it can take a few minutes, it can take 20 minutes.
Yep.
So reactive strategies is kind of tough. It's kind of out of the question. I think more in terms of proactive strategies, right? So being introspective, right? So that means going into yourself to understand what is actually driving the anger, learning how to build self-esteem and confidence in a healthy way. setting goals with passion, purpose, and process. I know you talk about the 3 Ps when it comes to goal setting and a lot of work with your clients. Then we get into other options that are proactive. I would say, exercise or some other healthy way to release some of that pressure. Again, you think of that analogy you gave of the soda can or the soda bottle. You got to have some way to let the pressure out a little bit. Exercise is a good way to do that. Humor is also a good way to do that. Meditation, breathing exercises, and then in general, kind of opening up, right? So therapy or just another person who you can, kind of open up and talk to and get some of this stuff out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any other suggestions for you, John, in terms of what people dealing with anger and what they can do to handle it?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned it too. I think one of the most common, or I find myself in a common conversation with parents who are calling of saying, like, my son is having tantrums or he's being really angry. Can you help us? What do we do when we're in those moments? And like you said, I have to sort of be the bearer of bad news and sort of tell them, like, you've already missed your opportunity. If he's lost and he's like having a tantrum, he's really upset or really angry and exhibiting that, he's not in a place where rational thought is going to be processed, right? That part of the brain, that prefrontal cortex, sorry to be jargony, front part of your brain right behind your forehead, basically shuts off when the amygdala and limbic system starts firing, and you're not able to sort of comprehend any type of, and actually what I usually say is that trying to suggest coping skills in the moment is probably just going to exaggerate the situation and make it even worse. Yep. So if you're if you're,
because they can't listen in that moment. Yeah,
no,
absolutely.
You're actually not meeting their need by, it sounds sort of backwards, but you're not really meeting their need by telling them to do something when they're not in a place that they feel that they're in control. So you usually see, parents are like, well, I try to tell them to breathe, or I try to tell them to go for a walk, or I'll try to tell them to go read, or right, or use some of the skills that we talk about in the preventative way. But when he's reacting, it's not going to be effective. And so one of the analogies is that I use is that while it's more difficult in the moment to use skills, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be practicing them when you're feeling totally normal.
Yeah.
And this comes into the preventative work. And the analogy that I use is, if you're in the woods and you're getting chased by a bear and you come across a bicycle, you do not want to be learning how to ride a bicycle in that moment. You want to already know how to ride, jump on, and go. And so when I talk about building skills and ways in which to make ourselves feel more in control and not have these anger outbursts, a preventative is key. And actually, not only are you practicing for the potential moment, you're actually putting yourself in a calmer state periodically throughout the day. So a lot of the times, these strategies, not only do I you tailor them to the individual client, but you also say, like, in the morning, you're going to wake up and you're going to do 10 breaths. You're going to set your goals. You're going to do some mirror work, which we'll get into. And then you're going to go about your day. Halfway through the day, you're going to do some more breath. We sort of, I frame it, especially with athletes, it's no different than any activity that you would be practicing to cultivate to sport. You're just cultivating your mind, and that requires practice. And, we talked about this in earlier episodes, that a lot of the stuff that we talk about sounds simple. And I think, you talked about this a lot, of like, it's easy to dismiss, like, oh, okay, this guy's telling me to breathe, or this guy's telling me to write or set my goals. That can't be that simple. So then I'm just not going to try. And, it's interesting, from the people that actually do engage and get right into it, the response from them is that it works. And so, I think that the biggest piece, like practicing and not being afraid to start doing some of these things is the biggest part that I run into, at least in the beginning, and like really trying to emphasize the importance of that.
Dude, totally. Because I think one thing you touched on that I want to highlight is that there's almost this stigma still, I think, where, and we talk about breaking down stigmas and how the general stigma with mental health has definitely come down a lot, enough for us to even be here doing this podcast, right?
Yep.
But another a sort of mini stigma that definitely exists is the stigma between physical health and mental health. I think physical health, not in the general way that most people talk about.
Right.
Like physical health, people are much more accepting about understanding that things take practice, right? Mental health, I think a lot of people have this illusion that it's supposed to be some aha moment that, and especially in therapy, that it's like, you just go in one session, that's going to lock it in, you're going to click into the answer, and everything's going to be solved. And it is not like that. I mean, this stuff requires practice just like anything else in life does, right? If you're going to practice a sport to get better, you're practicing, if not every day, 4 to 6 times a week, for multiple hours usually, right? Mental health is no different, right? You have to be doing these things on a regular basis to really be in the best mental health you can be. It does not just happen by, snapping your fingers or coming to some epiphany that just clarifies everything. And so, I mean, there are certainly moments like that really are impactful and help. but that's not usually the way it goes down. So
No, I
that's
think if
definitely a
you talk to most therapists, those like aha moments that we like yearn for, or that when we learn about in school and things like that. I think that if you were to talk to most therapists and did a poll, I think that they would say that the change that they see in clients is incremental, right? It's not the majority of change that they see isn't like this like. We all have those moments where you're like, you can see the click that goes on for the client, and those are great. But it's much more.
Yeah, that's like once a month for all the people we work with, right? It's
right.
like if you're
like,
lucky,
you
get 10
it,
of those
right?
a year. Yeah.
But I don't think it happened. And I think that's still the perception that
Yeah.
like going to see a mental health provider, there's going to be this like, oh, okay, now I'm just better. And,
Yes.
and and I think that that's obviously the goal, but that takes incremental steps and change to be able to get to that point. There isn't like some like light switch we can just turn on in your brain to make things go away and feel better. It is a process to be able to get there, and practicing the skills on a consistent basis is part of that.
Especially because, we have talked a lot about how mental health issues, anger, it's cumulative. It builds gradually over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. Guess what? The solution also has to happen gradually over maybe not as long, but a decent chunk of time, right? It's not going to happen just out of the blue. Like these patterns have formed over a long, a lifespan sometimes. Right. And, some of these athletes that come, they're usually in their 30s by the time they're coming out about this stuff and learning about mental health and learning how to communicate and other things. Think about all that's a 25 to 30 year head start on a lot of problems forming.
Practicing the wrong way.
Practicing the wrong way, right? If you're an athlete and you practice the wrong way for 3 decades, it's probably going to take you a little bit of time to unlearn that and then relearn the right way to do it.
Exactly.
So on that note, I think with anger, another point I want to kind of hammer home a little bit is that a lot of anger is not the person's fault who's expressing it, because they've likely had someone who's a role model in their life model anger as a way to cope. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage anyone who has anger issues to look back at your lifespan in terms of family members or friends. Usually it's family members, usually it's dads, unfortunately, who have modeled anger as an acceptable way to cope with stuff, because you unknowingly took that in for a long period of time as just unconsciously, because you're too young to even understand it, unconsciously sort of absorbing like a sponge. Oh, something happens, boom, I react with anger. Something happens, boom, I react with anger. Yep. And so they learn this, and it's not even their fault because they're not even old enough to make that decision about what to take in and what not to take in.
Yep.
You take in what's around you. So, stepping back and saying, who was my role model, and who out of those people, who really exhibited anger as a fairly common coping mechanism? Because when you see that, you can at least step back and say, I don't have to do that anymore.
Yep.
That was something I was around. I had no choice in. I can now decide to redefine how I want to handle things, and set my own model moving forward, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing I want to touch on right toward the end here is that, while anger is almost always a bad idea, something we want to solve and prevent us from getting to that point, there are some exceptions. I would say the exception is when the anger is less impulsive and more intentional, right? So we talked about how specific sports situations for motivation, there's a plan behind it, right? It wasn't just impulsive flying off the handle. Someone worked with you or someone else to say, how can we harness anger? How can we get to the right amount, right? We talked about how that's a slippery slope, but still, if you're able to find that balance, you did it intentionally. It wasn't like it just flew off the handle. And then when standing one's ground and advocating for yourself and others, and again, this is where, especially for Serena, as a woman, as a black woman, you have to know when to advocate for yourself. And it's really important that she sets this model behavior as, sometimes you have to stand your ground and you got to exhibit a little bit of anger. And this is, to me, ties it all back to this incident where she wasn't out of control. No. She was not out of control. No. She said, that's not what was happening. You misinterpreted it. And I want an apology for that, right? You're costing me a game here.
Right.
I'm an athlete. I'm a competitor. And she said there was no swearing. There was no aggression. There was nothing, right? So that, to me, is her using anger in the exact right way, right? Because sometimes you have to stand your ground, put your foot down, make your presence felt, and people will not take you seriously if you don't have a little bit of anger to what you're saying, right?
Yep.
Not a lot, but a little bit, right? So I think that, to me, is an example of where when you're advocating for yourself on the tennis court or with a doctor, you got to put your foot down about stuff sometimes if you want to make things happen the way you need them to for you, right?
Yeah,
so
I think you made a good point about it, like intent versus impulse, right? Like
yes.
If there's intention, that's great, but if it's impulsive, you're not in control.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. And most of the time, it's impulsive. So we usually get into a grim drive example. I mean, I think we talked about, I think Serena pretty much takes the cake with that one, and just in terms of like, not obviously the relentless pursuit of excellence in many different areas, but she also is not just, we talked about how, Grim Drive is not workaholism, and it's not overlapping, an act with your self-worth. It's not those things. She embodies this perfectly, right? Where she is absolutely committed to doing everything she wants to do, but not just tennis.
Yeah.
She's already, she went to school for fashion.
Yeah.
She's gone to school for pre-med stuff.
Yep.
She's a businesswoman, entrepreneur,
Mom, spouse.
right?
Yeah.
Mom, spouse, just does everything, has a balanced life, but approaches it all with purpose and intent, and is completely locked in.
Yep.
To me, that's exactly, because she's not struggling because she's obsessive in one area of life and has no balance. She's just got it all tied up. I mean,
Yep.
it's in a nice way. It's quite unbelievable, right?
Yeah, gold standard.
Absolutely. So that's our Grim Drive example, Serena herself. A quick reminder, just click and subscribe on your podcast listening platform and rate and review the podcast if possible. We really appreciate all feedback. We're also going to offer a free pair of Celtics tickets to a game in 2021 to 2022 for one lucky person out of all who write an honest review for us in the first 3 months of 2021. Again, these tickets are for next season. This season, it's unlikely that fans are going to be allowed, unfortunately. You can enter to win these tickets by taking a screenshot of your review and submitting that through the Contact Us option on our website at grimdrive.com. It will ask you for your name and email address, and will provide you with the option to upload the screenshot file. So make sure you take the screenshot of your review before you actually click submit. One other reminder that all the helpful information and links we described in this episode, we'll make those available on our website at grimdrive.com and in the show notes as well. Thank you for listening to the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about Serena Williams and anger. We will be back next week to talk about Michael Phelps and ADHD.
Thanks, everyone.